Thank you. Thank you. Hi, everybody. My name is Patrick Chanezon, and I work at Docker. And today we're going to talk about what I call the Docker way, the Docker DAO. I'm a big fan of Lao Tzu, and you'll see I have a few metaphors around Taoism and the way that Docker works and the philosophy behind Docker. So first, a little bit about myself. I really loved Dan's presentation before because when he shows his history of cloud computing, basically that's my career. So I started at Netscape, and then I was at Sun in 2000. Then I moved to Google, and I have just one fix in his history of cloud computing. The concept of platform as a service was actually invented at Google with Google App Engine, but Heroku, I agree, was more successful. Then after that, I moved to VMware for Cloud Foundry, that open source platform as a service that Dan talked about, to evangelize that and create the evangelism team around Spring and Cloud Foundry. Then I moved to Microsoft for Azure on the .NET side, but also Java and Linux. And very quickly at the end of my tenure at Microsoft, I specialized in that new technology that just came out that Solomon Hykes created in 2013 that was called Docker. And I just realized that a lot of our customers at Microsoft were using Docker to containerize applications and move them to Azure. So naturally at Microsoft it was a great way to bring some workloads to Azure. And so I started to focus on that and get specialized, and then I met Solomon and I decided to join Docker. So I've been at Docker for 2 years. Another thing, this is my daughter Charlotte, and she says ni hao. She's learning Mandarin, and so she's learning Mandarin, and she taught me how to pronounce that. Hopefully, I didn't get it wrong. So she says hi. And another thing I wanted to mention is, so as I said, I joined Docker 2 years ago. The reason I joined is when I started playing with Docker, I had exactly the same feeling I had 20 years before when I used the Netscape browser for the first time. So back in the days, 20 years ago, I was a client-server developer at Accenture. And so I was building client-server applications on Windows with a backend with an Oracle database. And it was a pretty painful process to develop these. And when I tried the browser for the first time, I realized, hey, if we put a server on the other side that serves the HTML, we could build all our apps this way. And that's how the concept of web apps took over. And I found that a very elegant and profound way in which we could build applications differently. When I played with Docker a few years ago, I had exactly the same feeling. This is the kind of tool that will really change the way we're building applications. And so I really wanted to be part of that adventure, and that's why I joined 2 years ago. Before we talk about the Docker philosophy, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the trends that I've seen in the industry in the past few years. The first one is Agile, and Dan talked about that as well. The way to summarize it the best, and especially for business people, not only for Agile, is not only about developers, it's also about the business value that they create. And the best way it has been summarized is by Adrian Cockcroft when he was at Netflix. Today he's at AWS. And he summarized it by optimizing what he calls the MTBAMSH. It's a fun acronym, but the meaning behind it is very real. So it's about minimizing the mean time between having an idea and making stuff happen. So you have an idea, you start coding, and your code runs in production. There's a whole process that goes into that, and that process is the Agile process. In Mark's talk this morning, he showed the whole chain from when you're pushing some code back to where it's in production. These tools help you do that. Agile was kind of the methodology that was introduced by Ken Beck in the name of XP in '99. I remember trying to introduce that in my team at Sun in 2000. It evolved into these Agile methodologies, and today everybody adopted that. I think it's a well understood fact. A second trend that's more recent, that's 5 years old, is called DevOps. And DevOps is another of these cultural movements, a real shift in the way people are working. And it's not only about tools, it's about people, processes, and tools. And so it's not only about the tools, people and processes are very important for DevOps. And DevOps is essentially devs and ops used to fight each other, and devs would develop the application, push the code on the other side, and let the ops manage it. And when cloud computing started to grow with Amazon, initially in 2006, in these companies like Amazon and Google, the teams who were creating the software were also the teams operating it. It's a famous Jeff Bezos memo about the 2 pizza teams where teams should work on a small bounded service, create the code for it, and operate it as well. And so that gave birth to that DevOps movement where devs and ops are working closely together, are using the same tools and the same processes, and are collaborating using a set of practices like continuous delivery that Mark demoed earlier today, infrastructure as code, so the IaaS platforms that Dan talked about enable that, having infrastructure checked in as code in your GitHub repository or in your source code control repository. Cross-silo collaboration is very important, having lots of small iterations and having that feedback loop between development and operations so that you can learn from what happens in production in your application. You do things like A/B testing, and then this informs how you're making your application evolve. So DevOps is a very important trend, and actually one of the reasons of the success of Docker is that it appeared at the moment when DevOps started to take off, and it was really the tool of choice for DevOps practitioners. But the people and process aspect is very important too. This is a number that shows why DevOps is important from a business standpoint, not only from a technical one. In 1999, the number of servers managed by one sysadmin in the Windows world that was not very automated, where people were spending lots of time clicking on dialog boxes, was 5. So one sysadmin would manage 5 machines. In the Linux world, which was more automated, it was around 50. In 2015, in large organizations like Google, Facebook, who are very automated, are using containers, the ratio is one sysadmin for 10,000 to 20,000 machines. And this is true for Linux and Windows. In the Azure team, they are managing hundreds of thousands of machines with Windows. It's all automated. And the factor here is a factor of 2,000. And in order to get these economies of scale, you need to standardize your infrastructure to treat machines as cattle and not as pets, as Dan said before. And also to create a containerization platform on top of that in order to manage all that. One thing I wanted to remind you is DevOps is not only about tools, it's also about people and processes. And Hank Kolk, who's the CIO at ING, gave an excellent talk at DockerCon touching not only about the way they're using Docker to do DevOps at ING, but also about how they reorganized the whole company, hired different type of people, and really changed the way they were operating the company in order to adopt DevOps. So that talk is really interesting. It's from 2014 at DockerCon Europe, and you can find the video there. And the last trend, Dan talked about that, so I'll go quickly on that, is microservices. So in year 2000, when I was working at Sun, the game at that time was really vertical scalability. You buy a big sandbox, you put your Java application that's vertically scalable on top of that, and then you're talking to an Oracle database that runs on another E10,000 big expensive sandbox. That was the way we were building applications back in 2000. It was the same in the .NET world, but there it was like big Windows machines. What happened is essentially Google. When Larry and Sergey created Google, instead of going to buy a big sandbox, they went to Fry's, which is an electronics shop in Silicon Valley, And they bought hard drive and computer boards and CPUs, and they assembled their own supercomputer based on all these different parts. And that computer was a lot of small computers together with an algorithm on top that would just expose it as a supercomputer. And so they started that trend of going from vertical scalability with very expensive sandboxes to horizontal scalability, where you have lots of very small boxes that run microservices and that are horizontally scalable. And then the whole industry followed after that. If you're interested in that, I highly recommend you to read Larry and Sergey's original paper from 1999. You can find it in PDF, and it's a very interesting read. You see the original architecture they had for the search engine that was distributed from day one. So that trend to microservice now took over the whole industry. Not only like the big web giants are using it, most of the new applications that are built in companies are now built with microservices in mind. But in order to do that, you need to adopt new tools, and you need to design your application in a slightly different way. So now let's talk about the Docker platform. So at Docker, we're building tools of mass innovation. What we mean by that is that we take some technology that is obscure or difficult to use, and we make it easy to use, and we democratize it. And that's what Solomon did. As Dan explained, he took LXC and Union File Systems and C groups, put them together into that Docker workflow that makes it super easy to use that. So containers existed before, but Docker really made them popular and easy to use. And the particular tools of mass innovation that we're focusing on right now, the Docker platform, is really a tool to help program the internet. Not only create software that runs on cloud computing or on-premise, but also can be used for IoT or software that runs in cars. Docker really can run in lots of different places. It's multi-architecture. It runs on lots of different types of machines. So the way we're building that platform is in layers. And so we start at the lower layer, which is we're building it on top of standards. And so the standard for containers is done in a Linux Foundation project that's called OCI, that we created with 40 other vendors and the gracious help of the Linux Foundation. And there we built two standards, one for container images and one for the container runtime. And so Docker provided the reference implementation for the container runtime, which is called runc. So that's the reference implementation of the specification. So you have a layer of standards, and then on top of that, this is built on top of infrastructure. And infrastructure, I consider myself a software plumber. When I present myself, usually to people who are not technical, I tell them I'm a software plumber. I just assemble things together and create systems. Infrastructure components are what helps you build your own container system and container platform. So at Docker, we have all these infrastructure components as part of a project we call the Moby project. So that's the upstream, the open source upstream from Docker that has lots of the components that we're using in order to build Docker. And lots of these components actually more and more are in CNCF. So for example, containerd is one such component. It's the core container runtime that Docker is using. We donated that to CNCF. On top of that, we built a development platform that is easy to use, that developers can use on their Mac or Windows, on their laptop. And it's a very easy to use developer platform. And then for people who go in enterprises and who want to put that in production, we provide a commercial product that's called Docker Enterprise Edition. So Docker CE Community Edition is the developer platform that's based on the open source bits. Docker Enterprise Edition has additional features that are targeted towards enterprise users who want to put containers in production. So what does the layers of a container platform look like? It looks something like that. At the bottom, you have something to do infrastructure management. On top of it, you need an operating system. On top of that, you have a container runtime. And then on top of that, you have an orchestration component. And at the top, you have application services. What does it look like for Docker? The platform we're building looks something like that. At the bottom, we have a component that's called InfraKit that we're using in our editions for AWS and other cloud providers to just manage the infrastructure declaratively. This is all these projects are open source. This is an open source project. We talked about giving it to the Cloud Native Foundation. It's still under discussion whether it will go there or not, but it's an interesting project to take a look at for managing your infrastructure declaratively. And it has drivers for lots of different cloud providers. On top of that, you have LinuxKit, which is a kit to develop your own Linux distribution that's very lightweight and secure and portable. So that's what we're using to create Docker for Mac and Docker for Windows. And essentially, it's a Linux distribution that's based on containers. So you just have a kernel in there, and you specify the kernel as a Docker image of the kernel version that you want to put in there. On top of it, we have containerd, and then which is our core container runtime. And then on top of it, the system services are running themselves as containers, and you specify the privileges of these containers using the OCI specification for capabilities and things like that. On top of that, you have containerd, which is our core container runtime. It's a pretty successful project in CNCF, and we're very happy to have it in there. Recently, in Kubernetes 1.8, there's a project in Kubernetes that we've been working on with Google called CRI containerd, which is a container runtime interface that allows, that's the interface that allows Kubernetes to manage containers. Right now, CRI is implemented in terms of Docker. With Google, we've been working on a version called CRI containerd that will allow Kubernetes to use containerd directly. And we're working on, so containerd is already present in Docker. We're approaching a 1.0 version of containerd, and we're working pretty actively to put that in Docker in order to leverage that. On top of it, you have our orchestration layer, which is called SwarmKit. And it's doing a lot of stuff. It's having a RAF store, so a store that's replicated across nodes. It plays the same role that etcd is playing in the Kubernetes world. Node identity, secrets, routing mesh, overlay networking, and then an orchestration engine in there. So Mark talked about that. You can get that on Ali Cloud, and it's a very easy to use orchestration platforms that runs both on Linux and Windows. And on top of that, you have application services. So the way it works is you have all these infrastructure components that you see on the left that are open source. We're assembling them in the Moby project. So the Moby project is a place where all these components are assembled. And so these components themselves can be part of CNCF or other foundation or come from other places. Then we assemble them in the Moby project, and we create these distributions or assemblies that we're using to build Docker CE and Docker EE. So this Moby project, if you go to GitHub Moby/Moby, you will see the assemblage of all the components that help us build Docker CE, and then we add some other more proprietary component to build Docker EE that's targeted at enterprises. And so the platform we're building is a platform to build, ship, and run any applications anywhere. It runs on any hardware, so physical, virtual machines, or any cloud provider. It runs Windows and Linux. And then on top of that, you have the Docker platform, and you can run any type of apps on top of that. And it works both for developers and operations teams. So that's what we're building at Docker. And then there are two versions. Community Edition is free and open source, and there you can get it from all these different platforms. You can get it on your Mac, on your laptop on Windows, but also on Linux servers like Ubuntu, Fedora. You can get it for AWS, and you can get it from Ali Cloud. The Enterprise Edition, the difference is that it is certified on the hardware or infrastructure on top of which it runs. So you get support with it, and you get a lot of features like a role-based access control, integration with LDAP or an Active Directory and stuff like that. So this one runs on the type of platform that typically run in the enterprise, Ubuntu, Windows Server, So that's what's used to run containers, Windows containers on Windows. It runs on Azure, CentOS, SUSE, Red Hat, AWS, Oracle, and Ali Cloud. Now I want to talk about what I call the Docker way, the Docker DAO. So I'm a big fan of Lao Tzu, and I've read the Tao Te Ching. And when I went to China, I thought, okay, the theme I wanted to talk about was about this, these two aspects of software in the enterprise today, where people have lots of legacy applications that they need to containerize or move to the cloud or be more agile with. And then on the other hand, they're building all these new applications with microservices. And to me, there were some concepts in Taoism that really translate really well the philosophy behind Docker. So let me go through that. So first, the philosophy behind Docker is that the best tools get out of the way, adapt to you, and make the powerful simple. That's really the design principle that we're following when we're building software tools for developers and for ops. And I think that's really what made Docker very successful. It's very easy to use. It made containers easy to use for everybody. Now, talking about Taoism, So I'm a big fan of Lao Tzu, and I love that Taiwanese cartoonist called Sai-Chi Chung. He wrote like a cartoon version of the Tao Te Ching, and I just took some of the illustrations from his books. I really love his books. It's a great way to get introduced to all these ideas. So the first concept that I found super relevant for Docker is called Wu Wei. I hope I pronounce it correctly. So Wu Wei, as I understand it, it means effortless action. And there's another concept that's called Wu Wei Wu, which is action without action. And this to me, so in Taoism, it really means that things that can be soft can actually be very hard, and that if you follow the way, you can achieve a lot without any action. And to me, that corresponds really well to what we're doing at Docker with the modernization of traditional applications. We have a whole program around that allows you to take existing application. You don't need to change any code, and you can Dockerize them and move them on-premise or in the cloud on top of Docker Enterprise Edition. We have a set of tools that our partners are using in order to do that. And when I say not changing any line of code, I highly recommend you to look at the Docker keynote for DockerCon for next week. So it will be live streamed. I built the demo that we're going to show in the keynote. And the demo is essentially an old Java app from 2000 called the Java Pet Store. If there are some developers in there, maybe you've heard about that. If there are some old developers, because it's a really old app, it's 18-year-old. And we just take the app as is, and we're using a tool to just take the WAR file out of it and put that into a container with a newer version of Java and Tomcat. And you don't need to touch the source code at all, and then you can start adding value to that application. So that's the notion behind MTA. Mark, actually, I'm very interested in what he presented this morning, that open source tool by Alibaba, which is a slightly different angle. There, you have some source code, and the tool will recognize what type of application it is and create a Docker file and a Docker Compose file for you. The tools we're using at Docker is more about, hey, this is my application, it's already compiled. Just create a Docker file that lets me containerize that without even touching the source code. So these two approaches are very complementary. Some will work for certain type of applications and other will work with others. But to me, that corresponds, that modernization of traditional applications really corresponds to the Wu Wei concept in Taoism. Yeah, and so when you're following the way and you use these tools that let you modernize applications without coding, this can be very effective without doing too much effort. So this effortless action is really something that that corresponds very well to the Docker philosophy. Then there's another concept that's called, I think it's called Shiran. Do I pronounce that correctly? Shiran? Or both, sorry. or Shiran, which means naturalness. And naturalness means following the way of the universe instead of fighting it. And the way, and that gives you a lot of power. And the way I understand that and how it relates to what we're building at Docker, is the 12-factor rules that Dan talked about. So following the way of the universe, in this case, to me, for cloud-native applications, it means creating applications that are a set of microservices with bonded context, that are container-based, that are stateless, where you manage the state into infrastructure-managed data services, and where there's no coupling in there between your different services. So that's kind of the modern way of building applications. And one of the things that Docker is very powerful at is it lets you use both. You can modernize traditional applications and create new applications based on microservices. So to me, the Docker DAO, the Docker way, is really about Wu way, modernizing traditional applications without coding, and Shiran, creating microservices application with the container platform that started the container revolution. So these are the two concepts that I think are important, and that Docker is very good at providing a platform for. So let's talk a little bit about modernizing traditional applications. Nowadays, in most large enterprise companies, 80% of the budget is stuck in maintenance of existing applications. And IT managers and CIOs are more and more asked to innovate in order to survive in a very competitive environment where new applications really make a business difference. And in order to innovate, they need to cut into these 80% used in maintenance. And so the way to do that is to use Docker in order to modernize your traditional applications. You start with an existing application, you use some tools that I talked to you about to containerize it, convert that to a container, put that into a registry. So Docker Enterprise Edition comes with a trusted registry that has access control and a whole set of capabilities like image promotions and things like that. Then you can deploy it on any modern infrastructure, whether on-premise or in the cloud. Docker Enterprise Edition works on both. And then you can apply modern methodologies like CI/CD. So that's what Mark demoed earlier with the Jenkins integration, where when you're making changes to your application, you just push the changes automatically. And then you can start to apply microservices modernization. And here what I'm talking about is even an existing application, by adding microservices to it, you can add business value to it. An example that I've seen recently is by just adding a few services like an Nginx proxy in front of an old Java application, an open source OAuth implementation, you can add Google authentication to any old traditional application without changing the source code. And then you can start breaking your monolithic application and start cutting away at it and creating the new functionality in terms of microservices. So that's the modernization of traditional application. And it really allows you to cut into these 80%. And it allows you to have like great cost savings. So this is an example from MetLife, who talked at DockerCon last year. They did a consolidation of VMs, and they had a 70% consolidation ratio for their applications that were running on VMs by containerizing them. And so they had cost savings of the order of 40%. So they had a lot of leverage by doing that modernization. We see more and more enterprises doing that nowadays. The other aspect is to create new native microservice cloud-native applications. And so for that, I highly advise you to go to the website of my friend Chris Richardson. We used to work together at VMware. He was part of the Spring team. He has this website where he talks about the design patterns for building microservices applications. This is a very good page. Chris is a great teacher. I highly advise you to invite him. He loves to travel as well. And I know for a fact that he loves Chinese food, so you should invite him to your next conference. So he talks really well about the different design patterns for building microservices applications. And so the Docker platform running both on Windows and Linux allows you to create these. It's a very natural platform for creating these modern microservice-based applications. Actually, the visualization there is from a tool that Adrian Cockcroft created to visualize your microservice architecture. This is an example of the kind of things that our users, our enterprise users of Docker Enterprise Edition are building with Docker. So it goes anywhere from automated development pipeline at Activision. ADP is using that for both traditional and microservices application. Société Générale, same thing. MetLife, it's really about migrating these traditional applications. Visa is all about the new architecture. They're doing more microservice. But what you can see there, that it's all over the map. Many companies are doing both. And I think we'll see that pattern a lot in the future. So the Docker way is really about modernizing traditional applications and creating microservice-based applications. And if you haven't read the Dao De King in a long time, I advise you to go back to it. So Docker in China. So China is very advanced in its adoption of Docker. I think it's the number 3 country worldwide for Docker adoption. So at Docker, we were super interested into getting in that market. And the best, one of the best users of Docker in China was Alibaba. And it's also the best partner for us to come to China. So we announced a partnership with Alibaba last year at this conference. And the partnership was launched in April this year. So if you want to buy Docker Enterprise Edition, you can buy it from Alibaba, which have an exclusivity in China. If you're going to the Docker booth, I think we're in D3, you can find some of the Alibaba engineers can help you get Docker there. Oops, sorry. Sorry, that was a little bit fast. Oops. Yeah, so Docker and Alibaba, it's a strong partnership that will help modernize IT for Chinese enterprises. And we're very hopeful about this partnership. You can find me on Twitter at Chanezon. I'm Chanezon on WeChat as well, so you can add me in there. On Weibo, I'm a happy French geek in Chinese. And then you can find this presentation. I will just put it on my slide share. You can download it from there. So I'll let you take a picture of that. I'll upload it as soon as I'm done this afternoon. And then in order to get to learn more about MTA, you can go to docker.com/MTA to learn about modernization of traditional applications. All right. And then you can come at the booth so we're in. So we have 2 talks. One at 10:30, Introduction to Docker Enterprise Edition, and one at 2:30 called Modernized Traditional Application with Docker Enterprise Edition at the conference. You can come to the booth in D3. That's what our booth looks like. We have lots of swag. You'll need to deploy a container to get one. And for those of us who are traveling, it's next week, so it's a little bit last moment, but we're having DockerCon Europe. I think it will be streamed, so you can watch the keynote from there. There will be a lot of interesting demos and announcements there next week. So that's for the booth. The last thing I wanted to touch upon is we launched a Docker Professional certification. So if you're a Docker professional, now you can get certified. It will launch, the first exams are happening next week at DockerCon Europe, but the global registration, including China, will start in October 2017. You can learn more about that at success.docker.com/certification. And if you're a container professional, this is a certification that really is worthwhile looking at. Thank you. Now.